Hello everyone, welcome back to the Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast, the podcast that aims to bridge the generation gap by debunking some myths, tackling stereotypes, and hopefully giving you some practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. Today I'm joined by someone who knows all about connection because he connects all the time over the phone. He is the telephone assassin, better known as Anthony Stears, and I've known Anthony for a number of years, and he lives, breathes the phone, which of course in today's era where apparently people aren't using the phone, or they're using them for very different purposes than the one I did when I was growing up. I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation. Anthony, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I'm excited. Your new podcast as well. Oh,
I know it is very exciting. Lots of great things, and one of the things that I know in your world, and we're going to come to this in a moment, about the myths surrounding the telephone usage and how people use it and where does it fit between different people. Because I actually spoke to somebody who was a silent generation the other night who said, "Yeah, I've got rid of my landline." And I thought, wow, I wasn't expecting silent generation to get rid of their landline, but they have indeed done it. And I say that as someone who was a little bit behind the curve because I didn't get rid of mine until about halfway through 2024. So I was a little bit behind everybody else on that one. Anyway, let's get to the first thing. I'm always intrigued by people and whether they identify with the generation that they were born into. So in other words, what generation are you? Do you reckon you display the traits of that generation? Where don't you? Talk us through your generation a bit.
Well, I was born in 82, which I believe makes me a millennial. I snuck in by a matter of months. And I suppose I feel older than the generation I'm supposed to be part of. I don't know if I just now feel more old-fashioned and not resistant to technology. But yeah, I don't know how I fit as a millennial. I know that people tend to think they're on their phones a lot, and yes, I'm on my phone a lot, but I'm technology-wise probably a slower adopter than the rest of the millennials, I suppose, out there that might embrace technology perhaps a bit more than I do. But that's probably more of a personal thing than a generational thing, maybe.
I think also, but the one trait I think you do probably display is because you are a big collaborator, and that's something that millennials are particularly good at. You're not in terms of you are prepared to put your head really above the parapet, which allegedly some millennials are less inclined to do, but you're definitely a big collaborator.
Absolutely, yeah. I work best with people in groups and teams. Like you say, the head above the parapet, where as a speaker, we get on stage, so you pretty much put a target on your back there. It's a bit like being an influencer, but with a room full of people who need to react in a way that's going to change your entire day. So yeah, it's a little bit tricky, but I think the fear of standing up and speaking and communicating is one that's shared across pretty much all generations. I think they say that, I believe our good friend Andy Lapata wrote a book saying, and death came third, because people are actually more scared of standing up on stage or meeting new people than they are of dying and other things as well. So perhaps that's something that I think perhaps spans across all generations, although potentially gets labelled or pushed on other generations by more senior ones, shall we say.
I think you're right. It definitely is across all generations. And by the way, do you know it's got a term? It's called glossophobia.
Glossophobia.
That's the official glossophobia. There you are. You can have that. That's a trade for you. But that's the fear of speaking in public. And you're absolutely right. It's right up there. And certainly people, I think the joke is that, if you go to a funeral, you'd rather actually be in the box than you would be actually standing up giving the eulogy. But the other thing is about it as well that you could almost describe as being a little bit ironic is that those who wouldn't want to stand on stage want to be very vocal online. So they feel like they have a voice and that they have the confidence to be able to do that online, yet in a actual room with people, the concept changes, I think, for them. Yeah, there's certainly no shortage of people wanting to put their opinions across, but it's just how they do it, and actually whether they even fess up to who they are, because often it's anonymous as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's. I think we could go down a bit of a rabbit hole there. That's where trolls and stuff get online, and to make themselves feel better, aim horrible words at people in the hope that it's going to make their life better and make somebody else feel bad. I think it's it's a bit of a shame, but it's a great platform because we all now have the opportunity to be heard or read, depending on which way you approach it. So that kind of freedom of expression is there. However, it's not always done in a respectful way, and I think that's the bit where the miscommunication sometimes happen, or misinterpretation of what somebody means or how they feel about something can sometimes come off the page. Whereas when you're in the room, I find that when you're talking, you sort of wear your heart on your sleeve. People are able to read between the lines, whereas when you're typing and people are reading it, depending on what mood they're in, will depend on what actually leaps out at them.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's that whole thing of the way we communicate, and body language is a part of it. By the way, in our study that we did last year, the generation that claim that they are the best at body language, funny enough, are millennials.
Really?
Apparently.
Oh, okay.
Just drop that one in there for you.
Well, I've done a lot of stuff in the world of recruitment, not more recently, but over the years. And one thing that always makes me laugh is most of them have never seen a CV that doesn't say that they're a really good communicator. Which is funny, because that tends to be the biggest challenge people have when working in teams or collaborating. It's actually the communication part that is going amiss.
Well, let's talk about that, because when we look at technology, probably nothing has evolved so much as the telephone, from its humble beginnings with Alexander Graham Bell, and then all the iterations going through the thing. Not that you were around at the time, and I wasn't before you say anything. But I was of a generation where the phone was literally in the hallway, and
if
the
you
one
wanted to
phone
have a
in the
phone
house.
call, you had to sit in the heart of the house that everybody else could hear, whispering.
Yes.
And yes, there was a notepad and everything right by, and sometimes a phone, your own little phone book with all your contact numbers in it, written down.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
And by the way, my mother still has one of those little phone books. Yeah. You know, the little bit where you slide the bit down and you push the button and it pops up with the right letter.
Oh,
anyway,
yeah.
Still got one of them.
Oh, brilliant. Well,
but the other thing,
one video that really made me laugh recently that my wife forwarded me was a lady who's a professional nanny, and she was talking about the 3 children that she looks after, and they came up with the concept that they needed a telephone that was for everybody in the house, that stayed in the house, because they were having trouble communicating and talking to each other. And she thought that the child thought that this was a really great new idea. And the nanny was just laughing to say, "Oh my God, you're talking about a house phone."
Well, actually, the other peril, of course, of those days was the party line. And for those of you, anybody who's under 50 probably, if there were limited phone lines available, so sometimes you had to share it with somebody else. So you'd pick up the phone and there might be somebody else on there. "Oh, get off the phone. Okay, we'll finish. We'll finish, and you can have a go." Bizarre. But you look at from those days, and you look now where a phone actually, for a huge swathe of people, isn't even used to speak. How do you, in your world, how have you navigated those changes? Because, I mean, first of all, how long have you been involved in teaching people how to use the phone and to get them to actually speak? And then how have you navigated the iterations of the phone and the development of it?
So I've been training now, it must have been for 13, 14 years, I think it is. And I wrote the book about 12 years ago now, I think. It has changed a lot. There's smartphones now, so people can do all kinds of things on them, and now they've been given AI. God help us, we've now got all kinds of opportunities and skills at our fingertips, or even at our voice command that our phones can now do. It's tricky for me because often when it comes to sending digital messages in the world of work, I often say that sending an email gets it off your desk. It usually doesn't complete the task. If you need somebody else to do something, then you can send a message. But if you've already sent them 3 emails and they haven't responded, then you tend to find that a 4th email probably isn't going to make much difference, and it needs that kind of human intervention. Now on our phone, as well as picking up the phone, we could actually then send a text message. We've got WhatsApps, we've got direct mails that we can do inside the social media platforms. So we've got loads of different ways to communicate now. And I think that it's useful to be able to reach out on different channels, different platforms to different people. And I know that I've got certain contacts that favour certain platforms. So there's certain ones that tend to use Facebook Messenger still. And they'll respond to that quite quickly, whereas a WhatsApp they may not see for a few days. So I think they're the kind of things that change. And I'm just slightly worried that these smartphones lull us into a sense of security of thinking that we're smart, or allowing us to pretend that we're smart, and that we're perhaps not engaging our brains and engaging with people as much as we could do. It's very nice and reassuring to talk to people, to get a clarification or an answer, or an acknowledgement even sometimes, just to know things have moved forwards. Whereas digital communication, there's a lot of misinterpretation that you tend to find will come when you're reading stuff as opposed to listening. And that's usually where the issues tend to come up that I see.
And what about in your work, in terms of, because clearly that will have evolved enormously from the days of just picking up the phone. I've seen you do that exercise where, right, get your client, get them on the phone now, or whatever. How has that evolved, A, because of the way the phone's been used, but also with the generations, with this so-called, well, first of all, actually, before we get to that, are Gen Z reluctant to pick up the phone in your experience?
Oh, despite what I'm told by many of their managers, I don't think they're reluctant to pick up the phone. I just don't think that they're as accepting of rejection or wanting to willingly walk into a situation where they could be rejected as freely as some of the older generations, particularly in the sales world. So back in the day, you were given a phone book or a yellow pages. So these were physical books with numbers in them. And that was your database. And you used to phone through with very little information at all. And you'd have to talk your way through and try and use some charm and some humour and see if you can find the right person and identify an opportunity and go down that route. Whereas nowadays, with a few clicks away, you can look somebody up before you phone them. So you can check them out on LinkedIn. You can find out how long they've worked there. You can see what their career history is, what roles they've held. So what I've noticed is, despite the fact that what I would describe as older managers managing younger teams, what I often end up explaining to the managers is they're not scared of the phone. You just don't know how to tell them to get prepared and to feel prepared to make those calls. And this is where younger generations, I think, tend to surpass the older generations, is when it comes to online research, they are a whiz. They're really quick at finding stuff and following links and seeing blogs and stuff like that. So once you can show them how you can gather up that information and then use that as ammunition in your conversation. So how do you break the ice and kind of get them to be friendly and get them to open up? How do you show a kind of an interest and ask appropriate questions that show that you're not only interested, but you either need clarification or even just that you care? So that's the main thing that I think has changed. The older salespeople will tend to, excuse my phrase, wing it, pick up the phone and depend on their charm and experience of just talking to people, whereas younger generations don't want to walk into that risky situation without knowing a bit more. So personally, I feel that they have an advantage. The disadvantage that both seem to have is when you're in sales, you usually go into sales because you're good at talking or you get on with people, but potentially you're not great at admin. And this is where both sides fall down, where if you don't put enough notes in your system and you don't document some of the conversations that you had, it can then be really hard to pick up that conversation at the same level of rapport and momentum when you come back and revisit it a week or two or a month later, for example.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So you, as a result of that, you've recognised the differences in the generations and how they are, and I really like that nuance of, you know, being able to prepare more and therefore almost overcome what their nerves would have been. And I loved your comment earlier on where you were saying about this thing of, you know, you just don't hear from people sometimes. And I'm not talking about people ghosting you, but just, you know, well, did you receive that? I'm not sure, you know, and it reminds me of the George Bernard Shaw quote about, you know, the greatest illusion of communication is the assumption it's taken place.
Yes.
Yeah. And you see that a lot. So coming back to, you know, Gen Z then, do you find that once you're able to give them that backdrop of, well, you do your prep first, you do this, and this, actually then the phone isn't such a scary thing?
Yes. So once they realise how the prep can then help them and how that can then be weaved into a more natural sounding conversation, then the fear of rejection tends to, well, the fear of you might be able to control the conversation, I think it starts to disappear. Once you then give them an approach that isn't the old-fashioned, this is what we do you want to buy it, yes or no, and you're going to get lots of no's, I tend to give them an approach that feels more like you're dropping off a pizza menu. It's a proactive outreach. It's like almost a public service announcement on behalf of your company as opposed to a hard, cold call, sales call type of approach. So I think if you can combine the confidence of how they can use that research and a strategy that avoids rejection, then actually they quite like picking up the phone. They like talking to people. They find opportunities. And this stuff applies. I do a little bit of charity work with a famous athlete, and he works with NEETs, so not in employment, education or training. And I give them, I do the same stuff with them as I do with businesses, but I'm helping them to find a job as opposed to find a client, because the principles kind of work in the same way. And we've had really shy children, I say children sort of 16 to 20, who have been very quiet and shy and unassuming and haven't really engaged too much in the sessions from what Chris has told me, yet I get them making some phone calls, lining up interviews, and the helpers in the room are gobsmacked about how they roll up the kids just seem to roll up their sleeves. They do it, and actually it works, and they light up and realise that actually there is opportunity almost at the end of the telephone. So that's a lovely moment for me when I get to work with younger people too, because this stuff, works in all areas of life really. And that's what I loved about your generational stuff about communicating. And that's the one topic that none of us can agree on, because we all have our own views and opinions on how communication should work. And we've all heard that listening to respond and not to understand kind of quotes that people tend to have with this mentality. So it's interesting across the generations for sure.
I love the way you say interesting. That's such a loaded comment. But we'll gloss over that.
It's my job interesting. Maybe that's what I should have said.
Just before we started recording, we were talking about a post that I did last year about voice notes. Mm-hmm. And I started analysing it and thinking, hang on a second, what's the difference between a voice note and a voicemail? But of course, a voicemail, you have the risk that somebody might actually pick up the phone on the way to you dropping off your voice note. Yes. And in our survey that we ran last year, there was one comment saying they really liked voice notes because they felt it was more personal, because people could hear the tone of voice as opposed to thing. Yep. Meanwhile, and that, by the way, was, surprise, a Gen Z. Okay. Gen X, meanwhile, said they felt it was really lazy because they then had to sit and listen to someone making up their mind as they meandered through to get to the point.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to lay any sort of thing, but where do you stand on that one?
Well, it's interesting because I've got a client and his team love WhatsApp, but he hates WhatsApp. And what he hates about WhatsApp is audio files being sent to him. And his big complaint about it, and bear in mind he must be in his 50s, his big complaint about it is, well, then I have to listen to it. I can't look at it and decide if I want to read it or if I'm of interest. I have to listen to it. So that annoys him. I suppose, like you mentioned, the difference between sending somebody a voice note and doing a voicemail is a voice note to me is somebody who wants to broadcast and not engage. Whereas somebody who's left you a voicemail was hoping to engage and they've ended up leaving you a message. Whereas when you send a voice note, it's more of I personally think it feels more of a broadcast than an engagement tool. But I can kind of see it from both sides, and a bit like podcasts, for example. Podcasts are a fantastic way for people to get to know you. So they might have heard about you, they might have read one of your articles, but actually coming on and listening to you speak, they'll then start to feel like they get to know you, and now they can kind of see that they could work with you. So I think it can be reassuring at one point and feel personal, but it can also be frustrating and feel unpersonal to the next one. So I think it's that tightrope where you can't please everybody. I think that the tip is to do stuff that feels congruent and natural to you, but is respectful to others at the same time.
Well walked on that tightrope there, Anthony.
Yes.
Very good. And actually, it's quite interesting because you touched on it earlier. Something that I always say to my clients is about this thing of understanding the way that the recipient of your call or whatever, how they like to communicate, because obviously that mirroring is a very effective way to get a strong connection with somebody.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're talking to somebody who is particularly quiet and shy and softly spoken, if you come out really noisy and bolshy, and there'll be just a mismatch, and you might find that they go even quieter. Whereas that mirroring thing, it's people like us, can work really well. And I've seen, you even see mentalists and performers who do mind reading stuff, and actually subtle little things can actually make people react. If you're in a pub or a noisier environment with some friends, if it's quite noisy and you're all having a bit of a laugh, and you lean forwards and go, guess what? I've got a secret. And you lean forwards and speak quietly, you'll probably find that most of the table will lean in and talk quietly. So you can actually affect how other people act around you. But if you want people to feel more comfortable, try to be similar to them or in their kind of range or style, to help them to feel comfortable. And I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and it's not that you're not being authentic by changing your communication style with the people that you're with. The example I give people is, if you went down to the pub with your friends, you'd probably speak and communicate in a slightly different way as if you took your nan to the pub for a Sunday roast. Okay? Now, with your friends, you'll probably be a little bit more playful and jovial and a bit louder and perhaps a bit crude or rude with jokes and topics that you talk about. Whereas you probably wouldn't do that with your nan sat at the table. You would be more respectful. And it's not that I'm not being myself. I'm just being respectful to the people that I'm with. And there is that thing of fitting in, but again, it's got to feel natural at the same time.
Does that message resonate across generations when you talk about this in your sessions? Does that concept land equally well with all generations?
Well, you can then just get people to realise that you can adapt your style to the person that you're speaking with or the situation, and it doesn't make you any less authentic. And I think people want to be authentic. They want to be themselves. Yeah. And you should be yourself. But at the same time, if the person that you're talking to is nothing like you, being your usual self you may not be able to pass on that information. You may then have that quote that you mentioned earlier on, the illusion that a communication has happened, but somebody just hears something so alien to them that they just ignore it, or they think this isn't relevant to me, or that this person doesn't understand me, and therefore I probably shouldn't listen to them.
Anthony, I can't believe it. We're nearly at half an hour. So
No.
I just want to fit. But it's great. That's what good conversation's all about. And I always like to leave people listening with some really valuable takeaways of things that different people that I talk to who come from experts of different fields. What top tips would you give to anybody who wants to bridge that that generational communication gap that we see in work, obviously at home and other places as well, but particularly at work? What would you say?
So there's, I suppose there's a couple of things that I would suggest. Firstly, when you're speaking to somebody of a different age to you, some of the things they say might surprise you. And it's really good to understand why they think that way or why they've said what they've said. So my tip would really be that when you're in those conversations and somebody says something that you weren't expecting or that shocks you in some way, ask a follow-up question, okay? You don't just go, why, like a child all the time, but you can turn around to somebody and just say, so what makes you say that? Or why do you think that would be the best course for me? And that way you can then start to understand, and people can then justify or explain their comment, their advice, whatever it is that they're sharing with you, and you can start to get a bit more of an understanding, rather than the conflict situation where they say something that you disagree with. You go, oh, well, no, I totally disagree. I think it's like this. That's a far more combative situation, whereas looking to find out why they think something, they may know something that you don't. They may have read a study or had an experience that you have yet to experience that they can share what happened from that. So it's worth asking those follow-up questions, particularly when they don't say what you're expecting. But from a working perspective and in working environments, and I work in lots of different companies of different sizes and all different age ranges as well, I think there's probably a few initiatives that you could do to help bridge that gap a little bit, and that's by creating teams or engineering teams that have different generations in it and getting them to work together. That can be really helpful because having those different perspectives brings a whole new sense of inclusion and different ideas to the pot, which I think is great. You can try and make the effort to have lunch with a colleague that you don't know in your business once a month or something along those lines. I've got some companies who do a get to know the team kind of video, and it's not something that they post on social media. It's an internal thing where I might record a little message to say, hey, everybody, I've worked here for 5 years. I'm into this and that. You may not know this about me. And they get to share stuff, and you might get to learn a bit more about your colleagues, and therefore be a bit more understanding.
And you know what? It's really interesting to say that, because it's the simple things like that that can make the world of difference. Anthony, we are sadly out of time. Have you got your book by on your desk there? You can just show us.
I do have my book, and I'm very excited. My new online academy has just gone live. So helping people with conversational confidence. I've got all kinds of resources. If you follow me online, there's loads of free videos and tips on there as well. But yeah, hopefully some of this stuff has resonated with the listeners. There's a few tips there that people can put into practice. And I look forward to looking in a bit more detail at your the study that you did as well, because there were some really interesting stats that you've already shared with me on those. And I think it'll be really helpful for anybody in the business, in the work environment, to understand a bit more about this stuff. So thank you for inviting me on, Alastair. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's been great chatting. I'm going to put Anthony's detail in the show notes so you can see where he is. In the meantime, thank you, Anthony, so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us as well. All the details in the bottom, please. All the usual things with podcasts. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another brand new podcast, so make sure you join us then. Otherwise, look at generationallyspeaking.co.uk, where you can find out more about what we do. In the meantime, we'll see you again soon. Anthony, thank you, and bye for now.